there, and we need to be able to encourage this in a way that works. The good news is, on energy efficiency models, they've moved quite quickly because the cost of energy was such that the paybacks were quite fast. And I think we have to now tackle it almost on a war footing to see that we can actually handhold them through some of this as we go ahead. And lastly, I would touch on commodities and deforestation. Clearly, there are commodities like timber, paper, palm oil, which can be produced unsustainably and have a significant impact on critical ecologies for the country, indeed for many countries. And what is also happening is that if we don't get this right soon enough, the companies that indulge in this activity begin to get frozen out of the market. We saw this through a whole palm oil initiative, which was initially by activists, including organizations like Greenpeace, which then brought global multinationals to their knees in terms of supply. So the other side of it is, if we don't get this right, what happens very quickly is whole sectors of industry that are maybe growing palm oil and not doing that, as happened in the case of Indonesia, in a way that is measured and that is seen as destroying forest, get cut off the supply chain into the global MNC world. And so whole industries collapse, which don't help the economy. And this kind of activity is clearly happening through the international capital markets, who are looking specifically for how companies are adhering to norms, how sustainable are they in their approach. So for us, again, we have to be able to guide our companies, to guide government in a way that we are not left hanging because projects suddenly shut down and we then have an issue. And that is what might happen, for example, if you have a dam that hasn't thought through all the issues, and then the financing just isn't there because at the end of the day, nobody wants to put their money in it. And the world is at the moment full of what we call stranded assets, assets which banks have refused to finance. So they never got completed, or if completed, or it's an old power plant, 40 years old, there's no ability to actually, for it to run further because nobody at a global level wants to fund these projects. So we have to be forward-thinking in the way we set about looking at finance, in the projects we fund, and the financial architecture we put in place as we raise money therein. So thank you.
Thank you, Naina, for those very insightful comments. I think for India, we should recognize that India does not want to go down a path of reckless and wasteful consumption as some of the developed countries did in the past. Our approach is not like, let's say, China, where you say that we'll continue, going per capita, in a per capita context of the year 2030 or whatever, and then we'll go down. If we have the money and the technology, we are happy to start. It is in our interest to keep our emissions down. And I think ultimately our citizens would demand it of any government. You have correctly pointed out also, and I think another speaker too, about how we took the correct initiative in doubling our clean energy tax on coal and the money going to the National Clean Energy Fund. 400 rupees a ton, that's a pretty good amount. And that is not recognized by others, unfortunately. I would like to see an India where there are no inverters and no generators, where we have energy coming from new renewable sources and where we can use it in the right direction. But as you said, there are weak capital markets in India. There are NPAs. The NPAs of our banks need to be addressed. And if we look at financing, we need to see how these need to be properly taken into account. Now, if you look at sustainability annual reports, and that's my last comment, I'll open it for discussion. Many companies have now started doing it, but I find that very few Indian companies are resorting to internal carbon pricing. They don't have an idea as to what is the cost actually in carbon terms for producing a product. So I think while they tick off the sustainability annual report, they need to do a little more homework beyond that. With those comments, I will now open the floor for discussion. Kindly identify yourself and please point out to who in the panel you would like to address that question, if there's somebody in particular. And I give the floor to the gentleman at the back, then the lady here, and the gentleman who just raised his name card.
My name is Ajay Mutreja. I've been involved with hydropower plants way back in 1985 when I was working as an advisor of Kingdom of Bhutan. The innovative public-private partnership models which were tested out by us, including developmental funds, we received obviously the fund from Government of India at that point of time to set up the Chuka Hydel power plant, and I was the advisor at that time. And I like what Naina you talked about. If you look at bundling some of the funding opportunities, combination of development impact funds which are available in plenty. I'm right now involved with around 10 of them for Northeast India and through FICCI for many rest of the country, including in East Africa. Second, I also like the idea Professor mentioned about the crowdfunding. Now, when I look at everything that's happening in Northeast India, one of the biggest problem is that no single village can afford to set up even a very minor solar, whether it's rooftop. So I think if you can elaborate a little bit more, Naina, on your concept of bundling, let's forget municipal, let's look at developmental impact fund, innovation, public-private partnerships with some crowdfunding. Thank you.
The floor, Naina.
I think your question in itself has the answer in that we have to look at innovative models of financing even as we look at innovative models of delivery of public goods. And those public goods, in the example of solar are key. We do know that there are entrepreneurs that come in, and as long as the model is one where the pricing allows them to make a profit, and it should obviously be a profit within norms. But if the model is right, and it's not just seen as something that it has to be a delivery of a low-cost service, then it can work quite well as well. So to me, the most sustainable answer has to be these models, and there are companies that are doing this in a very meaningful way. There was a company, and I think you might even know which one I'm talking about, where they're doing this off telecom towers and using the power to provide it to communities around. They're working very closely with the community. It's a for-profit model, and it works. And they're having no issue financing it, and they're finding multiple entrepreneurs that are coming in. So if we can apply our minds to creating financeable projects, which in a for-profit way, which gives entrepreneurs a chance to step in and run these profitably, we can certainly look at some of the issues as you describe it. But distributed power, distributed sanitation, distributed everything is, as I see it, the answer. We cannot have a city like Delhi still doing only 30% of its effluent being managed by big plants, which we don't have the money to put up. But we can set up small STPs at every RWA, which actually does this for a minuscule cost and a per unit cost, which is a quarter of what a large project does. But we don't think beyond big projects. And I think we have to begin to look at these distributed models. Yeah.
Thank you, Naina. I'll just give the professor one to say a word, but I agree with you. I think we need to look at, and in some parts of the world they are doing that, looking at each house generating its own electricity. So you don't have any wastage for transmission, and then you see what to do with it. If there's extra, then the funding comes to put it together and pass it on to somebody who needs it. Professor, you wanted to say a word, and then
thank you very much about
question.
Village Fund. I think if India can start several villages of what Japan has been doing, and many people who left those villages working in Delhi or abroad can also contribute some money in addition to those local community. So I think 1 or 2 examples should be created in India that can be spread in many parts of India.
Yeah, with the decline in solar energy costs, I think that might be something that has a grand future. I give the floor to you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. I have the question to Nen. You know, the state distribution companies are in terrible trouble. Uday is also not working. There seems to be this huge resistance to actually paying for electricity, paying at a rate which will allow profits to be made. Now, if you bring in green issues as well, unless there's a steep decrease in costs, how is it going to work? Like your point about tax revenues rising, but that is long term, and you're talking about now, charging now. So how do you charge now against a long-term rise in taxes? Or take out financing, all these NPAs, infrastructure, banks were lending short tenure when for long-term infrastructure, and they were expected, take-out financing was expected to come in. It didn't. Why didn't it? And why is it going to come in now? So where do you see the change making it possible? Yeah.
Thank you. Nena, would you like to comment briefly?
So if you look at our failure in not developing the capital markets, and I say this with Rakesh sitting right here, because Rakesh was one of the guys who worked to make it happen. There was an effort, but I don't think there was enough understanding of the criticality of the issue, frankly, in the Ministry of Finance. So we had a lot of policy and push falling between the stools, which we obviously still need to work on. It's happening. At least the ability of our insurance companies, pension funds to step into the space has now been created. And there is global money, global pension fund money and insurance money, which is also now available to do this. So we will and are seeing solutions of this order where the takeout is being provided by the capital market, sometimes with a little help from multilateral agencies, but fortunately also from the private sector. So I'm quite hopeful that that part of it happens. The second, and you're right, I mean, we've got a hell of an issue with the state electricity boards, and it's something there are, workarounds which we're going to have to keep looking at. To the extent that renewable energy, of course, has seen a huge push by the government, but the price point has become one which I'm now beginning to worry it's so low that the industry itself is going to kill itself, a little like the telecom sector. But it's hugely competitive today. So the issue of price differential is much less of an issue. And if you look, therefore, at the price of renewable energy, both the capital cost, and it tends to be, capital intensive, but then much cheaper going down the line, it's actually the right way for us to go. And the government's very ambitious targets, I'm sure, could be achieved. But what is also happening is there's a lot of private sector. Don't forget, every factory in India had a power plant as a backup. And those receivables are 100% a function of what that company is. And some of it is AAA and some of it is bankrupt. But the fact is that some of these projects also are beginning to replace old fossil fuel-based technologies. And they're kind of out of the SEB grid system. So those are the sort of workarounds we can start with. Rooftop solar, buildings, all of this are very interesting. There's a quiet revolution happening through strict regulation in water efficiency as well, where companies and large companies largely comply with water standards, not because they're dying to do it, but because they have no solution otherwise. They need that water. 30% of India's power plants shut down in summer because they don't have water. You're going to have to use the water you have efficiently. So I think these things will force us. A poor grid giving me poor power, which shuts off just when I need it, will mean that I will have to look for solutions for myself. And then hopefully if they're green solutions, they will be the answer. So it's not a perfect solution, but we sort of limp there, sort of sticking bits and pieces together in a manner that it all comes together in our favor ultimately. Yeah.
Thank you, Nana. You have the floor, sir, at the back.
Thank you very much for these excellent discussions. My name is Matthias Helble. I'm a research fellow and senior economist at ADBI. I have a question to Amar about the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord. We all know that the INDCs are actually not enough to reach the 2 °C target. And we also know that the poorest country will suffer most. But I feel that we focus our discussion for the moment purely on mitigation efforts and not much on adaptation. So is this true? And what is your take? Do we need to start now the discussion on how to help, especially the poorest countries, to actually basically adapt, and what are their needs in terms of adaptation? Thank you.
You have the floor.
This year, the chair of the COP is Fiji. So there will be a lot of focus on adaptation, but not only adaptation in the sense of building infrastructure that is more resilient, but actually very fundamental adaptation to particularly rising sea level and extreme events. So in the Caribbean and in island states, the SIDS, as we call them, they have put forward a platform. And they are looking to take the big hit. We often these days talk about a desert now in terms of concessional finance, climate finance. The Green Climate Fund was really a very watered down proposal, and that also is not being funded. So I think it's very, very important right now not to let go of this, the impact that climate change is already happening and what support is needed. And the two areas I feel where adaptation are particularly important is those countries and those areas that are most vulnerable, but also for global public goods in support of adaptation, particularly in the agriculture sphere. So for that, I think we will put a lot of emphasis this year in the COP23, I know, and that will require, I think, a lot of also signals from the G20 that they are behind it. And so far, the language is there, so we hope it will stay.
Well, if I may add to that, I was in Fiji just a couple of weeks ago, and the Prime Minister of Tuvalu drew attention that the Global Climate Fund had sanctioned $36 million for his country, which, as you know, is going to be hit by sea level rise, and they don't have a cent as yet. And he said they put in $11 million of their own money out there now, and he's wondering whether he'll ever get it back. He says, we don't have these kind of funds. So there are issues out there, and just to add that adaptation has its own problems. It delivers immediate and future benefits, a little more than mitigation, but it has its limitations also, and you need a lot of funding for some of those countries out there. But the gentleman right down center.
Yeah, Mr. Amar Bhattacharya. My question is same about Paris Agreement. The way Donald Trump is withdrawing, they're trying to bully the rest of this 170 country, or what's their purpose trying to withdraw? And the way they are saying India is the main beneficiary, billions and billions of dollars being paid to India. So this is a humiliation to India, or what is the rhetorics?
No, let me handle that. I think there's really no basis to what he's saying. And I think the American authorities have understood that. Even in their presentation now on the White House website, they changed a bit of the wording that they're using. India has really not, as if we are soliciting funds in that manner. Absolutely wrong to describe it in the way it has been done. And let me say, there are 197 states parties out there. And if one withdraws, the others, I don't think you'll have anyone else who will be joining that camp. Everyone else, the EU, the developing countries, are very keen. These are in our own interests. If we don't do it, who will? If some country with funds doesn't want to come forward, well, so be it. And you'll find up there are many. There are mayors of cities, there are governors of states, there's industry, there are major CEOs out there who are saying, well, that's the government's commitment, but we'll do our share. We'll step forward. So I think that would be, unless you want to add on something to that, I think that may be enough, and we might take one or two more questions.
Just precisely on that point. So we had an event this past Tuesday in Brookings on, the impact of climate action in the U.S. as a result of the withdrawal of the U.S. from Paris. And the overwhelming message was that the withdrawal of the Trump administration is not the withdrawal of the US. There are 10 states, 900 major multinational companies, including every company in Silicon Valley, 100 cities that have already signed on saying that they will abide by the Paris Accord. So, and when you add them up by the weight of GDP, already 50% of the GDP of the United States is saying that it will abide by the Paris Accord.
Okay, one quick question, the gentleman out there. Yeah, in the blue shirt. It's your turn.
Yeah, thanks. Just a twist on the earlier question, and maybe this is more for Amar, but perhaps for you, Ambassador. So, I mean, clearly the signing on to the Paris Agreement was conditional on the availability of finance. It may not have been billions and billions of dollars, but it was one way of acknowledging the historical debt and what have you. And to some extent, that has been picked on by the US as a pretext for its withdrawal. So what happens to that architecture from a negotiating point of view? Do the countries who signed on conditionally say, okay, good try, but you know, we're in it for ourselves, or does it fundamentally undercut the architecture of the Paris Agreement?
There is a technical part about the financing that is important to understand. So when we take this 100 billion that is put on the table, most of that money is not public concessional. Most of it is from multilateral development banks, and about a third of it catalyzed from the private sector. So when we talk about the funding, the major risk right now is, will the multilateral institutions live up to their commitments that they have made in stepping up this gap? And as I said before, the 100 billion is not enough. If we want to meet the amounts of finance for clean energy and clean transport and water and everything else, we need in the trillions of dollars, as Nena pointed out. So the goal that we are pushing for is for MDB financing to be increased from something like 50 billion a year to about 200 billion a year. Where is the potential block on that? That's where the United States becomes very important, because they have already signaled that they will not support an increase in the capital of the World Bank. And that's where the rest of the G19 and other parties have to come in and say, if it's not done through the World Bank and you won't do it, we will do it through other means.
Well, just to add on for what it's worth, I remember asking from the responsible person in the World Bank, just before the Paris Agreement, and they said the funds that they give, they don't add on to the Green Climate Fund in any case. And to the point you've made, well, you know, in one sense it might open up for a little more ambitious effort by the countries that remain, because I think you pointed out, correctly so, that part of the reason that this is an agreement that looks like a legal agreement, but actually there's nothing legally binding in terms of technology or financing in it, is because of USA. So now that that's away, maybe the EU might try a little harder. And US is not completely lost to the rest of the world, because their companies, their CEOs and governors and mayors, many of them have already made it abundantly clear that they will be joining in this effort to help address the concerns of our planet. I think with that, I need to bring this session to a close. I thank our three distinguished panelists. It was very kind of you to spare the time and to present your views before this audience, and we are very grateful for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, panelists. And now we break for tea. It's a half-an-hour break, and we'll reassemble at 5:45 for the annual G20 address. Thank you.